Welcome to the High Low Bro Show, episode 11. I'm Garrett Chaffin-Quiray.
And I'm Richard Rian.
We welcome a pair of filmmakers,
Max Woertendyke and Dane Elcar,
who have brought to market their latest work, Brightwood.
Brightwood centers on a couple, Jen, played by Dana Berger, and Dan, played by Max Woertendyke, and they don't really know how to talk with one another because their relationship is falling apart. The setting is a really nice pond in the middle of a wonderful northeastern forest, and as Jen and Dan run around this pond, circling each other through conversation, through periodic disagreements and overt fighting, they start to feel that they're being watched, and they start to notice odd traits in this environment, traits that suggest they've been there before. There is a kind of a twist and surprise ending that I want to leave to the viewer and not spoil it here over much, except to say that there are some unexpected graphic elements that eventually show up and change the course of the stakes that face Jen and Dan.
So, Dane, I am struck how much it's a genre blend. It's horror, sci-fi, and a kind of cerebral psychodrama. Can you talk to that kind of genre category a little bit?
Well, I will say that when I started thinking of the idea, it was kind of a short film before. I had made a short film called The Pond, and that's kind of the genesis of it. And I always thought of it a bit like a Twilight Zone. And I never, in terms of genre, I never thought it would be a full-on horror movie. I know there are horror elements in it. I know there are sci-fi elements in it. When I jump ahead a little bit, when I started writing this, it was really about the characters. I knew kind of the environment that I wanted to kind of thrust them in to this kind of time loop.
One of the things that I think makes the film so complex and interesting is that you suggest that Jen and Dan, like all of us, are kind of schizophrenic, that we don't have one personality, we have multiple personalities. And
well, I think that comes out of time to me. You know, I've been in a long-term relationship. You know, you're not the same person you were 10 years ago or 5 years ago, really. In essence, the idea of these people kind of literally being stuck in time, that is these multiple versions, the different places you are in a relationship and kind of going in and out of toxicity and love. And that's kind of where that stemmed from.
I know that Bergman is a big influence on you, and it's strange to think of a low-budget horror sci-fi flick as having a big Bergmanian influence. But that's one of the things that, of course, resonates through all of Bergman, that we don't have stable or fixed personalities. We actually have multiple personalities. And that's one of the things that I think Brightwood does really well.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I will admit, because I do love Bergman. I don't know if I was thinking particularly of Bergman as I was writing the story.
I always thought about this as an actor. You know, I mean, there is a certain sort of scenes from a marriages sort of thing that happens in the film. You know, I was always fascinated by this idea as a kid, you know, that like all of our cells are regenerated every 7 years. And so like literally on a purely cellular level, we're a completely different physical being every 7 years. And, you know, this thing that sort of happens to Dan and Jen in this circumstances, there's sort of like an acceleration of that process. The film, you know, sort of drops us into these series of people.
And unfortunately, most of us feel that we're a different physical being, and it's worse as we get older and older. And that's kind of what happens to Dan and Jen.
Well, if you were to look at it like in a psychological way, it is kind of reverting slowly back to like a basic survival self. And that
surviving the marriage, right? This is any of us who have been in a marriage or a long-term relationship understand that it's kind of like going to war. And you
certainly sometimes can be.
It was really cool. There was a divorce coach and relationship therapist recently watched the film and decided to post a video about it. And one of the things she talks about in the video is this idea that, you know, at a certain point in Dan and Jen's relationship, it's like they've become sort of adversarial allies to maintain this relationship. That in a way, it's the worst versions of themselves that find each other. And as Dane was sort of saying, there's this idea, I think, that there's a de-evolution in a way. They become less encumbered with sort of the highbrow things, and in a funny way become much more engaged with the lowbrow things, which are this sort of primal survival, lizard brain way of making it through the world. And in that way, they seem very well matched. But, in their higher functioning world, when they're at a party together, when they're trying to deal with their careers together, when they're trying to engage in the sort of our modern contemporary world, obviously they're not having a very good time of it.
And yet they do become allied to each other. That I think that is an experience that a lot of us have in a long-term relationship.
It's not you, it's me. And I've changed. I'm not the same person. Or you're not the person I married. I think these are like classic tropes that we hear. In order to save a relationship, you kind of have to destroy a previous version of yourself.
Bergman Scenes from a Marriage, which I believe was originally a multi-episode, much longer.
It was a television show.
Television series, exactly, in Sweden. You just watched this couple go through affairs, infidelities. There's a moment where the Erland Josephson character actually beats the Lee Volman character, and you just go, this man is despicable, and this is a really, really toxic relationship. And then the next thing you see is them going off to have a weekend affair together. And that's, I think, for those of us who have been in long-term relationships, a very realistic description of how they work.
Well, I will say that we have had people come to see the film, and their first response afterwards are related to their partners. And depending on where they are in their relationship, either positive or negatively, I've had people both say, oh man, I can't wait to go home to see my partner. Or conversely, like, yo, I think I need to break up with my significant other.
Yeah. For me, in terms of just the creation of the story, when it kind of clicked in my head, if I put a couple into this situation of being stuck going around in circles, literally, that metaphorically there potentially was something there. There was something that could really work. However, I didn't know if we could get everything together and actually get this all to work. So to hear you say that is lovely, and I do think that.
What was the kernel of the idea that you started with? Did you have a set of images, or Philip Roth famously says that he starts with a single sentence and he works on it now that he's late, that he worked on it for a month or two, and then when he got that finished, he knew where the rest of the novel was going to go. Was that how it worked for you?
It's different for each story. I'm currently working on a story that I've been working on for like 15, 16 years now. But for this, this was probably like five or 6 years ago. I basically just kind of had this thought or this image of someone being stuck, going around in circles. And at the time, I had a young daughter, so I would go on these jogs around a local park. And I'm kind of a amateur photographer, and I would always go and kind of watch the light. And the park became very important to just like getting out of the house with my kid and going around. And I said, this would make for a great location. And the ideas just kind of came together in a flash. Well, okay, he's stuck going around in circles around this pond. And so I shot that short film. And as I was working on that short film, that's when I got the idea that if you did have a couple in this scenario, especially a couple that was on the verge of divorce, that would be potentially a really interesting story.
What about the sci-fi genre elements? What about the whole paradoxical time loop things? What happens to a person when they encounter their double? I'm really fascinated by the idea of genre, and this film seems to have a very meta quality to me, in the way that I think one of the great, not just great horror films, but one of the great meta films of all time, Scream, does, which is that it's both about the genres of horror and science fiction, but it also kind of gives you feedback about how those genres work.
It's funny. I maybe Max would even remember this. I was always, as I was developing the movie and going through the visual styles of it, the film had in my head the images of inspirations of other films. So, like, for example, when she's running and she has blood all over her face, I would always kind of say this is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre part of the film.
There was a period of time where you were cutting to temp music from Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, exactly. And then when she's on the kind of island at the end, I always thought of 2001 when they're approaching the monolith on the moon. So
Wait, I don't see that. Man, that seems like a reach to me. But
no,
tell
just
me
just
how
in
you get
terms
there.
of what I was thinking about. I didn't make a homage. I'm saying that was just in conversation, especially with my composer Jason Cook.
Did you storyboard?
I love to storyboard. I usually storyboard. This was my first feature, and what ended up being more appropriate is that I worked with Max quite heavily on the schedule, and then I did a very intense shot list. And so I knew every shot of the movie in my head. And then as we were filming, sometimes the night before, on the side of the script, I would scribble in a kind of, rough story sketch that I could show everybody and kind of say, this is what I wanted it to look like.
How many shoots total in terms of days did the film take?
We had 12 out of 16 days. So there were some days off.
And then you did go back out there to
I did a lot of the
B-roll and
The script was how long?
I think it was around 83 pages, 84 pages. The movie ended up, oh no, it might have been like 88 pages.
It was probably, Dane, it was probably 88 pages now. And after, in post, a couple scenes got cut.
Yeah, exactly.
So we ended at 84 minutes, but I think it probably was running just about like the standard minute per page.
You know, what's funny too is that when you're an independent filmmaker, you hear horror stories about not having enough. And we shot a lot.
Dane, do you remember how many minutes of footage you had in total?
22 hours or something like that. It was a lot.
We had the luxury because we did a lot of rehearsing over Zoom beforehand. And because it was just the two of us, Dana and I, and because in some ways, and I'm sure this was obvious to you, but there's something that are a little sort of play-like about the way the film works. And so, we had this beautiful circumstance that the three of us were doing this great little dance. And what it meant was, though, that we got to do a lot of scenes from start to finish. Or, like if Dane knew, for instance, that he was going to cut at a certain cut point, we would run the scene from the beginning of the scene to that cut point. It gave us a lot of freedom to be able to sort of jump in, get the coverage, and then to be able to play and find this. Again, I think this word dance feels appropriate, where, Dana and I would do the scene and Dane would react to us, perhaps because I was so involved in the scheduling and in the sort of pre-production of it. Sometimes I would notice Dane shift a little bit to the left and I think, great, I think I need to get out of this shadow or into this light, So there was something funny enough, a little sort of play-like about that process.
Let me just ask about the number of takes, because you can rehearse scenes in theater, but you can't redo a particular execution in cinema. You have this luxury of doing a take again and again. Clint Eastwood, one of the really great American filmmakers,
one take, that's it,
like one or two takes, right?
Yeah.
Stanley Kubrick apparently made Tom Cruise on Eyes Wide Shut walk through a door 90 times.
Yeah.
I mean, this may be a filmmaker, it's a legend, but there are some filmmakers who just do shot after shot after shot. Dane, how many takes did you do typically?
Well, I mean, there's an insane luxury to being able to do 90 takes on a film set. For us, it was a very good example of planning ahead that allowed us to have more freedom. So Max and I worked on this schedule. We had everything down to how much time it would take to change the lens. What we started to notice by the second day is that we were actually doing pretty good in terms of our schedule. We were ahead of schedule quite a bit. That allowed me, originally you go into a film like this with the idea that, well, you're only going to have 3 or 4 takes, maybe 5, but that's the goal, 3 or 4 takes, and then you got to move on to the next setup. But we were going so fast. And because I was filming it and lighting it, or not lighting it, because a lot of it was natural light, the setups were really quick. I could just go here, change a lens.
How much time did you spend in production, and then how much time did you spend in post?
Well, hold on, just to go back. So we had more time to do more takes. I could say to Dana and Max, let's do it again. Let's try it again a little differently. And that really opened up how much we could play around with the scene, because I had rehearsed with the actors, but remember, I had only rehearsed with the actors on Zoom. And so every time we're on a location, this is the first time we're playing that scene. Now, in terms of how that translated into post, the rough cut was maybe like 4 months. Then you start dealing with sound design. And I did a lot of the sound design on this. So I would kind of do it kind of rough versions as I was editing it. And then you start talking to the composer, and I would send Jason Cook reels, and he had to, I wanted to give him some creative freedom, so he took some time to like create the score, which I was then able to use.
I think Jason Cook's score is terrific. Watching Persona the other day, your score and the Bergman score for Persona are very similar. There's a kind of traumatic, kind of droning quality that ups the psychological ante of the film. You sense that Jen and Dan are under this psychic assault at all times that involves the sounds that they're hearing.
I mean,
Right.
that's, I think very, very explicitly, the sort of entrance point to this loop they find them is this, this high ringing sound. Is his head ringing because he's hungover, or because they're undergoing some bizarre time warp, space bending experience that is presenting itself sonically?
It's also practically too, because I wanted to shoot a forest in the daylight, and typically when you do think of horror, everything's at night. And so part of creating the environment is incorporating these kind of haunting sounds, and the sound design was kind of going to guide us and propel these characters into the further into the loop. So that was always kind of on my mind as well.
Tell our listeners a little bit about Jason Cook.
He's a brilliant artist. He does a lot of ambient work. He's a DJ. I think he's done some albums under the name Courses and also Boys Hotel. I've worked with him on almost every short film I've done. Back in 2013, I did a little audio thing where I recorded a story, and he did the sound for that. Each project is a little different, but with this particular project, I was giving him these reels, which was like 15 minutes of the film at a time as I was editing it. I think my notes to him were basically like, kind of like what I said, this is the sci-fi version of the movie. I need it to be this thing. And then most importantly, I need, if you could get some kind of love theme in there.
So he reverse engineered the soundtrack.
Yes. I mean, honestly, Rich, I assume he did that. He might have just because I'm not in the room with him. He's in Ohio. I think that he watches stuff either with the sound on or off and is just purely inspired. And then creates the music.
He's releasing a vinyl version of the full 84-minute.
We've definitely been in talks about that, and I do think the plan is to happen at some time. He really went with it, and he went with the inspiration of the film, because what he ended up delivering me was like an 84-minute symphony. Unfortunately, I was not able to use it all. I was able to take bits and pieces of what he did and then place that into the movie appropriately. I never would have thought of this in a million years, but when there's those bells, those kind of chimes that happen at the beginning of the movie, just such a wonderful little inspiration that he had, and added those in.
What would it be like to take, for instance, instead of starting with the film and then having someone create a score, to start with an 84-minute score and then create a film to around it? I just think that's like conceptually interesting idea.
No, I mean, you're always inspired. See, I'm inspired. My answer to that is that I've been working with Jason so long that his music already kind of has inspired me, so that when I sit down to write a piece, I don't know what the music will be, but I can kind of go like, oh, I wonder what Jason will do there.
I remember, a number of years ago, Dane and I made a promo, a 3-minute sizzle reel for another project. And Jason did the music for that as well. But he did something else, which I'd never had done before, and which I really loved. He also sent over a sort of list of 10 or 12 tracks. These are commercially available tracks, songs, literally. And it was amazing. It was one of those moments where, as an actor in that, I heard this music and I thought, this is exactly the soundtrack that I would give myself. And so it was a really cool thing to see that not only is he brilliant in as a composer, but literally just his understanding of music, I think, as a means for communicating both emotion and ideas, and that it really serves a purpose.
Soundtracks always advance the movie. What I'm hearing you saying, Dane, is that Jason is kind of Ennio Morricone to your Sergio Leone.
I love the guy. I hope we can collaborate on many projects in the future. I think that what I love so much, and Max said it so beautifully, is that his inspiration just comes so organically.
I've had a number of friends over the years who are indie filmmakers, and one of the things that I notice is that when you watch a rough cut of a film, and then you see a later, more polished version of the film that includes a soundtrack, that changes everything. I think that most film goers, they kind of at an emotional level appreciate how important the soundtrack is. But if you actually watch the process of a film getting made, you see how much a really great soundtrack contributes to the final product.
If any of your viewers want to just prove this to themselves, they should Google Robin Williams' Mrs. Doubtfire horror. And there's a great little video where they've taken the Mrs. Doubtfire trailer, and replaced it, all the comedy music with like horrifying music. And you watch that trailer and you think this looks like the most terrifying film. My dad was in the theater, and as a child, he always used to say there are two things that give you feelings when you're watching a thing. It's the lights and it is the sound. And manipulating the lights and or the sound can completely change the experience. And as Dane said, it was a horror film in broad daylight outside. So in terms of lighting, we were working with what we had, and it stays consistent throughout the film. That's sort of part of the story. And so what we're left with is the music, the story, and the performances to hopefully give both an emotional journey and also an entertaining journey. One that doesn't just feel like, great, I'm just in the slog of emotional turmoil and a divorce, but hopefully also it's like how Dane on a number of cases use the camera in a way that I think is very funny, and sort of points out some of the comedy elements there as well. So when you're talking about genre too, Richard, I think we ran the gamut in some ways. You look at a film like Primer, which is a great film, very cerebral, but very not funny. Hopefully, and our experience has certainly been, Dan, I think you'll definitely agree, seeing the film screen live with an audience, one of the most satisfying things that happens is to find where the audience really gives themselves permission to laugh, both with the characters and sometimes at the characters.
Max, I just want to say that as having watched you on stage, I know you have a wonderful ability to switch between dramatic and kind of light comic touch.
Well, thank you.
The Dan character has just one funny line after another. So there's a moment in the film where he kills one of his possible selves, and then Jen,
she finishes the job.
Stabs him in the neck, yes. And I know,
as always, she is the more efficient of the two.
Our listeners are not going to believe that with all the gore in the film, that this has funny moments, but it does. And the light comic character is you, and this is a classic trope. He's both whimsical and dismayed about what he and Jen need to do to survive. When he seems to kill some version of himself, he throws up, and then he complains about his thinning hair, and then that becomes a riff.
Well, one of the things that always struck me of time loop movies a lot of the time, especially like Groundhog's Day, is that it usually is there is an opportunity for humor. There's an opportunity to explore relationships in a different way, because time loops are an impossibility. So you can have people reacting to something that normally never would happen. There was going into it in terms of the meta thing. I always wanted to say that we were making a film, that the camera itself was going to have a very strong point of view, and it was going to move along with the actors, and it was going to, show you things and not show you certain things. It's not seated in realism. In fact, I've always thought of it as almost an absurdist film about relationships and a satire. Now, does all of that humor land with everybody? We've certainly found not.
You found that you expected a certain response from the audience and then you got a
You
different
know, you never, I don't think I ever expect a certain response, but I found it funny and I found it a certain way. And you hope to express that in your art. And then you hope that people pick up on that. Now, what we found is that I think the film, in its kind of simplistic way, does touch a nerve. I always tell the story. When we first premiered in Austin at Otherworlds Film Festival, some guy came up to me and he had very sad eyes, and he was basically like, "Your movie really like disturbed me. It didn't make me. I didn't feel good watching it." And then we were in San Francisco, and some lady at the end screamed out, "It's her favorite romantic comedy of the year."
You know, one of the things that I think Dane did so brilliantly about developing the characters of Dan and Jen, you know, in a lot of these films, oftentimes, you know, you're dealing with like they're physicists or they're ex-cops or they're someone who is by nature very well prepared for the sort of insane circumstances they're dropped into. And one of the things that I think is funny about the film, and I think is also effective about the film, is that Dan and Jen are like very basic people. They're like truly normal people.
I find the complexity between Dan and Jen's relationship to become more layered and intricate every time I watch it.
Dana and I met each other doing a play. When Dane and I were talking about doing this film, you know, the first question we had, Dane thankfully agreed to put me in it from jump, but then we needed to find who our Jen was going to be. They had to be an amazing actor. We also knew that they had to be down with hanging out with a very small group of dudes in the woods for a week while we filmed a film that there was like, you know, there are no luxury trailers. Thinking about just sort of the Venn diagram of those two things, you know, Dana, who's a hilarious and brilliant actor, you know, and your audience may recognize her from Orange is the New Black. We were at sort of one of the moments of respite at the height of the pandemic, though. So, you know, we were taking COVID tests every 3 days or something. And we knew she was going to be game, and she's just a wonderful actor. And so I said, you know, Dane, before you read anyone else, will you just at least, you know, talk to Dana?
It was so important to us going into this environment of going out into the woods. I was going to be very busy, you know, with the camera, setting up the shots, getting everything ready. And Max, they needed to kind of have this bond where they could go off, Max and Dana could go off and kind of be the actors, and they could run their lines if they needed to, or do whatever process they needed to do, so that kind of we could meet when it was time to shoot. But yeah, it was very important that they got along. And when I did speak to Dana, one of the first things that I noticed is that she's extremely smart, but she's also very funny, and she's got a lot of absurd characters. And I knew that even though in some ways I'm having her play the more straight character, she was going to bring a sense of humor to it.
Dane, was there a Beckett / Waiting for Godot element in this?
I can only answer that and to say that it certainly is part of me. I love Beckett and I love Waiting for Godot, and I've watched that play so many times.
Having done a production of Godot, the physical actions, when they're dealing with the hat, when they're dealing with the rutabaga, they're not suggestions the way stage directions often are. They are instructions. I think of the scene, for instance, where we tap the hooded man on the shoulder. I thought of those sequences sometimes as little Latsies. And for anyone who doesn't know, a Lazzi is sort of a series of physical actions that often tell a sort of miniature story, oftentimes used in Italian theater for comedic effect. But I think we incorporated a number of those sort of Lazzi moments, and sometimes we incorporate them as the characters, and sometimes I think they're incorporated visually.
The camera, yeah.
Yeah, and even if we weren't thinking about, at the time, oh, well, this is an homage to, you know, the Commedia dell'arte, and so on and so forth, I think one of the cool things about all of Dane's background and my background, you know, Dane and I met working in a video store in New York City. And then we were roommates, and we used to run like acting workshops in the basement over in Williamsburg when we were younger people. Both our parents were in the theater and in the arts.
You share a educational heritage with obviously the great Quentin Tarantino, of just having become filmmakers working in video stores. At
the time of working at Allen's Alley, the idea of being a film producer, from being a filmmaker, was the farthest thing from my mind. I mean, at that time, I loved watching the actors. I loved watching great performances, but I really thought of myself exclusively as an actor at that time, and particularly as a theater actor, funny enough.
You know, Max comes to, if he hadn't liked the script, he wouldn't have done it. That's how I think he really thinks of his acting as well when he considers his part. One of the things that was so amazing to kind of edit his stuff together on the day, there would be choices and we'd do takes, but I couldn't really see some of the things until I got him in the edit where I could really see these arcs to his character come through very cleanly. And that happens because you sit down and you think of the story and you think of the plot and you think how your character progresses through the script. And I think Max has this incredible ability to and intelligence to kind of see the story unfold and to really feel it emotionally at the same time. And he's always willing to read and he's always willing to have discussions. And so without this kind of partnership with him, Brightwood really wouldn't have happened. And I think the same is with our next film.
Dane, as the filming went on, did you kind of change your attitude about what was going to be the end result?
No, the ending was the first thing that I always knew would happen.
That was your Philip Roth paragraph.
Yeah.
Dane was an extremely receptive writer-director, which isn't always the case. Oftentimes as an actor, you find yourself in a situation where you have to sort of twist yourselves in circles to make a line make sense. My job is to convince the audience that I would say it like this. And having to act that way is a real, for lack of a better word, pain in the ass. It's not fun and it sucks because you're basically spending all your time papering over the holes in the words. Ultimately, the decisions about how the film gets made had to be made by Dane. That being said, he created an environment in which if Dana or I felt the need to express that we wouldn't say a thing like this, or we think this thing could happen, we were able to collectively, creatively, and productively and efficiently engage in those creative conversations that sometimes, we were on different sides of. How's that for a producer's answer?
Yeah, I know that was a good producer answer. I will say that I don't, if they have a suggestion that I really thought was kind of not going to work, I would let them know. And I think that it's every step of a film is kind of a collaboration. What you're looking for is you're looking for fire. You're looking for a bolt of lightning. So the dialogue around the camera and, when it's not running is just what can we do to make this better? But that's the beauty of filmmaking too, is that you can, if you want to, give it a try.
Was there a particular scene, Dane, where you just felt like you had to nail this?
There is an encounter where Dan goes around and then runs into another version of Dana, and what essentially unfolds is a scene that is a kind of a mirrored version of a scene we've already seen, except now the stakes are completely different. And even though some of the dialogue is the exact same dialogue that we've just heard previously in the film, and I think getting that right and getting that tonally right within the not only the acting and the performances, which were well thought out of what was going to happen, but the beats in which they were walking and where I was going to place the camera. I wanted everything to kind of be on the opposite side of what we had just seen previously in the scene take place before. 10, 15 minutes later, you're seeing kind of another version of that scene, but the stakes are completely different. And how I could use the camera to tell the story. The camera, Max is on one side of the sign in the first scene, and then in the second scene, he's on the other side of the sign.
Dane, tell our audience just what's happening in that scene with the sign.
Yeah, Max, Dan, something very bad has happened to Jen, and Dan goes off running around the pond by himself, only to kind of come under a guilt that he has to go back and kind of see what happened to Jen. And as he's running back around the pond, he runs into Jen, who's perfectly fine. And then I think he's so shocked by it, he has to go and kind of throw up and kind of gather himself. And then he comes back. And that's where this scene really starts, which is where now we're encountering a Jen we don't really know. And Dan is the Dan we know, except now the stakes are just completely different. And as they're approaching this no swimming sign, these two characters start to have a conversation, which is essentially the conversation we've heard previously in the film. And I just found that fascinating. And I knew that as a storyteller, if we could nail that scene, I think it would be something that potentially I'd never seen done before.
Well, it's funny. I'll actually say that sequence was one of my favorite sequences in the film as an actor. And it was one that I found most intriguing on the page, which is ironic because you think, great, I'm going to say all the same words twice. For Dan in this moment, who has run away from this opportunity where he might have been able to save his Jen, only to discover that somehow she seems all right again. In a way, he's offered this second chance to try and get it right. So being able to play that was a really, really fun acting game. People sometimes in talkbacks ask, like, what's the difference between Dan 1 and Dan 2? And I always say,
there are 3 or 4 Dans, aren't there?
I think there's probably a great drinking game where you take a shot every time you think there could be another person, and I think you'll get drunker than you expect. But I think of the film as being broken up primarily into two sort of, it's bicameral in a sense. We have this first couple we spend a lot of time with, and then we have this second couple that we spend significant time with. And we get to see them engage in their relationship with their original paired partner, meaning that the person that they showed up to the pond with. Dan and Jen 1, who show up, that's what we deal with until that first murder. And then after that, we have this sort of transition period, which is what we're talking about right now, this moment where the two couples sort of overlap. They're mismatched. We have a Dan from one relationship and we have a Jen from one relationship, and they're now in relationship with each other. And Dan is trying to go back in time in a way. He's trying to capture.
Well, that dialogue is the only dialogue that they, have.
A humanistic element of the film, part of it that I think makes it kind of, it gives it a certain kind of tenderness, is the fact that Dan and Jen are continually trying to recuperate their relationship. They seem to be trying at various points to work things out.
But, in what I always think of as the breakup scene, they sort of agree. They say, when we get out of here, we'll start the process. And we say,
right.
we'll send a letter together, an email together, lots of emails. It felt important to have these moments where you could see why once upon a time that wasn't the case. Even though the thing that they're working together on at that moment is plotting how to break the news of their divorce.
I always wanted it to be the first part of the film, or at least the first couple that we see, was always going to be headed towards a breakup. And then the second half of the film was going to be, I wouldn't necessarily say it as a reconciliation, but an understanding in some way that they do have this love for each other. It's somewhere in there, and it only really comes out after they kind of forgive each other for the last 8 or 9 years that they've been torturing each other.
One last genre question, Dane. Mm-hmm. What about films like Loopers and 12 Monkeys, where you have characters re-encountering themselves and indeed killing themselves? Did you wrestle with the whole time loop question? And
to me, the time loop was just a plot device, really, that allowed me to explore the relationship. I always knew that I was never really going to answer too much of the why or the mechanics of the loop itself.
What predecessor films did you bring into both the writing and the final edit of the film?
I think that Stalker played probably a bigger part in some ways. There's a Kelly Reichardt film called Old Joy, which has two characters just walking deeper and deeper into a forest, and then kind of slowly we kind of learn of their past. The idea in terms of Stalker entering a space, a kind of new zone that was going to play tricks on people. And then as I think Weekend, Godard, I love the satire. I love the satire of the relationship, but it was really just kind of like a mood setter.
Let's talk tech a little bit here. So what camera did you use?
I shot on a smaller Sony Alpha mirrorless camera, and I did it because I knew the camera. I was proficient with it enough, and I knew that I was going to be using it, a lot of it, on a Steadicam and running with it. So it's a very lightweight camera. And I focused a lot of my attention on the lenses that we would use. And most of those were kind of more affordable cinema lenses called the Rokinon series of cinema lenses. The lenses and the different focal lengths are incredibly important to how you're going to tell a story, particularly in scenes with two people just talking. How wide are you going to be? How much of the forest are you going to see beyond them? What's going to the depth of which you'll see the focal depth? If you look, the start of the film, everything's much more in focus, and it progressively gets a little bit more hazy as it goes on. Once you're at those final moments when this couple realizes that that they do love each other, and they're going to say that they love each other. I have just them in the frame, and everything else is kind of out of focus behind it.
You guys had boom mics?
We had lavs and booms. We had a wonderful sound tech on set named Lester Pernalla, and he was there with us. Truth of the matter is, you don't need very much to actually make a film. You want to have the basic things, sound, camera, actors. I ended up wearing a lot of hats and doing a lot of things beyond just directing and being the DP, but that's all you need, folks.
Richard, you asked earlier if we ever had disagreements. What I like to joke about is anytime Dane bugged us on set, me and Dana just ran a little faster in the scenes.
Yeah.
Because he was the Ginger Rogers of the situation. Every time we ran, he had to run with a camera rig on.
And backwards sometimes.
Yeah, and backwards, exactly.
I do also think it was very hard physically. I had to spend, I think, a month after just kind of like healing from making it, because it definitely, when you're using a shoulder strap or have the Steadicam, it's pressing on your back.
There are a couple of shots where you're looking at the pond from overhead. Is that
that's a drone
shot?
That was a drone that Lester Pernalla had, a nice little drone, and we went out a week or so after the shoot and got those shots of just the forest and above the water. And it's magical stuff when it's like a cloud moves overhead and literally you can see the light shift on the water. We shot 100% with the permission of Rockaway, New Jersey, which is a great little town. We shot at Egbert Lake, and we not only had permits and the ability to shoot there, we went through the New Jersey Film Commission. So everything was very legit, and
the community was incredibly supportive. I mean, it's an active park and pond. So, there were fishermen and people jogging and kids on ATVs. At one point, we had to recruit one of the ATV drivers to convince his other friends to ATV farther away from our set so we didn't hear them.
People gave you your space to make the film.
Yeah, and
I do have to say I did want to kill a couple of kids here or there, but but yeah, no. Eventually, it did work out that they kind of all worked with us. It's always funny that you have to remember. Some people aren't really used to film sets, so they don't know how it works. So, we kind of had to go and explain, like, okay, you can watch, but you have to turn your motorcycles off because we do need to record sound.
So, Max, how can people watch the film?
The film is currently available on all major VOD platforms. So that's Amazon, iTunes, Vudu, etc. Earlier this week on Amazon, it was featured on sci-fi, horror, and drama simultaneously. There are DVDs available through Kino Lorber, if you believe in physical media. At some point later this year, it will also be available on AVOD platforms. But we're happy to say the film has been really wonderfully received. We're at 94% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. We just found out that we're going to be in overage after our first quarter. So the film is doing well. People are watching it, which is thrilling to know.
How are you getting compensated for that? We're not asking for exact numbers. But
no. I'll give the brief overview about how the sort of indie film economics work. Indie filmmakers like Dane and myself, we make a movie. And then what we did is we brought it to American Film Market and tried to find a sales rep. We ended up signing with a sales rep, a woman named Justina Kronkowitz out of Berlin with a company named Media Move. And then she brought the film and shared it with distributors and is continuing to share it with distributors in a variety of territories. So by territory, I mean geographic location. So our distributor in the US is a company called Cinephobia Releasing, who's a partnered with Kino Lorber. They are responsible for distributing the film here in the United States. We have, for instance, a different distributor who's responsible for distributing the film in Germany. In literally about 10 days, I'm going out to AFM, American Film Market, again this year, to start conversations about Dane and my next film, but also to see if that we can find some other distributors located in other territories around the world, the rest of Europe, Mexico, Asia, who may be interested in buying this film and making sure that it's distributed to those local populations. We want the film to be available worldwide. Right now, we have friends who are in Canada who would love to watch the film, who can't. We have friends in the UK who would love to watch the film, who can't. And so we would really like to find distributors in those places to, spread the gospel of Brightwood. Simultaneously, obviously, this is our own little pitch here, but, if you watch the film, any of your listeners watch the film, whatever they think about it, they should go on to Amazon or Letterboxd or IMDb and give us the highest rating possible. The more, there is no expiration on word of mouth for a small film like ours. We released on August 22nd, and here we are almost exactly 2 months later. The film is still being discovered by people. We didn't have a studio with a big P&A budget, being prints and advertising. So, we couldn't run big advertisements. We couldn't, buy, pages in the trades. We couldn't buy radio or Sirius XM or trailers in front of other films. We did not have those resources. And so everything that has happened has come out of good word of mouth, have come out of buzz, have come out of the fact that there have been people who have seen the film and liked it enough to say to their friends that they should go and watch it too. And that is incredibly humbling and thrilling for us as filmmakers to feel like, my God, we made something that people aren't ashamed to tell their friends to go watch.
Tell us quickly about your next project.
Max is going to be taking that to AFM. It's a real, I like to think of it kind of as a Hitchcockian thriller. It again deals with identity, and hopefully we'll be, able to work on that soon and go into production.
Yeah, we're in very early stages of the actually getting the financing and the production up. But I can say that it is a fantastic script. And again, like Brightwood, I think will be both sort of have something beyond just the entertainment, but should also be a really edge-of-your-seat thriller, while also asking some good, big questions.
What would be your recommendation to younger indie filmmakers?
Understand what you think are your limitations, and to understand all the try to learn as much of the various aspects of filmmaking that you can learn, and then honestly write something that you can make. Part of the way Brightwood is written is that I knew I could shoot it. I knew I could film it. And I knew we could get it done given the limitations that we had. And I think that was it's taken, I write all the time. It took me a long time to get to that place. And then again, the next step is you have to share it with people, because you can't make a movie by yourself. Get everybody together and make the film.